Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app, O'Connor and Company.
Picking up right where we left off last time we spoke, we got to get right to it in 30 minutes. E.J. Antoni of Heritage about this trade deal with the European Union announced yesterday. Amazing. 8:05, Sean Spicer. It's Larry O'Connor with Julie Gunlock. And Julie, we got Joe diGenova in D.C. Look, you're looking at what I'm looking at. Look at all the things we have to talk about.
I know.
Ton of things to talk about. Good morning, Julie, and good morning, Joe diGenova. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Good morning.
I want to talk about the continued fallout and revelations of the Russiagate hoax. Of course, the mass media is not covering it, and they're not interested in this story because they were part of it. But we are hearing more. We heard from CIA Director John Ratcliffe that he's got some more documents that he's going to be releasing. Tulsi Gabbard has more backup to show that Obama directed this. As you've been saying, by the way, it should be noted for our listeners, for about 8 or 9 years now on this program, Joe. But as you assess this now, it appears to me, you tell me, you're the legal expert, that's why you're here, but it appears to me they certainly have John Brennan dead to rights, at the very least on perjury, as he said over and over again that the so-called Steele dossier was in no way included in the intelligence community's assessment. And not only is that a lie that he said under oath, but it appears, based on the paper trail in emails, that John Brennan actually overruled his career CIA analysts and forced them to use that Steele dossier.
Well, that's true. And we're actually way, way beyond John Brennan at this point. You can consider John Brennan to be dead meat. He's going to be charged, ultimately. There is going to be a federal grand jury. There has to be, under the circumstances we now face. He's going to be probably the focus of a major part of the investigation, which will be held not in D.C., but probably in Florida, where Mar-a-Lago is, because that is the most serious overt act in the conspiracy to deny Donald Trump his civil rights occurred at Mar-a-Lago when his residence and business establishment was raided by the FBI on a pretextual basis.
Can I pause you there real fast? Because some people are not connecting the dots here, and they're confused. Sure. They're like, well, what does the Mar-a-Lago raid have to do with the Russia collusion and the intelligence community's assessment of the 2016 election?
Well, what you have to understand is you hear about all these different things. You hear about the intelligence community assessment. You hear about the report of Devin Nunes, which was filed away, the classified version of his report, which was filed away in Langley. You hear about the Obama meeting with the members of his cabinet to discuss conducting a counterintelligence investigation. You don't look at a single item. You look at all of these items together. The raid on Mar-a-Lago was just one overt act, and everybody has to start learning that phrase. An overt act is part of a conspiracy. A conspiracy under federal law is an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime under federal law. And that, what you have to have in order to have a conspiracy is at least one overt act in furtherance of that conspiracy. What we have in the conspiracy against Donald Trump is hundreds of overt acts, of which there are the raid on Mar-a-Lago. The President Obama, for example, decides that the presidential daily briefing, instead of being distributed to maybe 12 people, is now going to be distributed to 150. Why did he do that? To increase the possibility of leaks, to damage Donald Trump. Remember, Obama makes a series of decisions as he exits about intelligence information, one of which is redoing the last intelligence community assessment before he leaves office to harm Donald Trump. That is an overt act. That decision to redo the intelligence community assessment, the decision to decide to distribute the presidential daily briefing, the single most important intelligence document prepared every day for the President of the United States, the decision to increase the distribution of that for no good reason from 15 people to 150 was an overt act. And why was it done? It was done to make sure that information about Donald Trump that was in the PDD made it to as many people as possible so it could be leaked. I think what you're going to see is a major conspiracy indictment involving a number of people. President Obama, presumptively can't be indicted for what he did as president. However, if while he was no longer president, he communicated with people who were involved in the conspiracy previously, and that is considered an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy, President Obama can be indicted for that as part of the conspiracy because it happened after he left office.
Okay, and just to put a fine point on it, the idea is that the raid on Mar-a-Lago was to access, or to assess, I should say, and confiscate records that Trump had in his possession that revealed much of this. They were trying to go back and get that stuff from him, right?
And they were trying to they thought he may have had a copy of the classified report by Devin Nunes, the one that was just unsealed the other day by Tulsi Gabbard. By the way, Tulsi Gabbard and John Radcliffe are going to be releasing more detailed individual documents, which are being declassified right now at the Department of Justice, which will put much, much more meat on these bones. But for all these people and the Democrats that are saying this is all a show, this is a distraction, they have to say that because they don't have any choice. Because this conspiracy is so big and so damaging to the Democratic Party that that's the only avenue they have. You'll watch, for example, the ranking minority member in the House Intelligence Committee was on television this morning talking about how this was all a distraction, that none of what you were hearing from Tulsi Gabbard was true, that John Radcliffe didn't know what he was talking about. When you hear stuff like that, you know that these folks are bailing water out of the boat.
Well, to say it's a distraction from Epstein is just so hilarious. We saw that with Kirsten Welker, with Lindsey Graham, et cetera, over the weekend. Joe, real fast, and because we do have other issues beyond this, although I think this is like the story. I actually have seen some people who I believe in good faith are trying to sort of sort through this and are open to the idea that there was manipulation of intelligence data, et cetera, to harm Donald Trump. And I kid you not, I heard one of them say, okay, let's say that Obama and Comey and Brennan and Clapper, let's say they did what you're claiming they did, that they threw out one of the daily briefings that was in draft mode that said that Russia didn't affect the election and they weren't favoring Donald Trump, and then they decided to create this intelligence community assessment that said the exact opposite, that was fake and lied and said that Putin was trying to manipulate the election and succeeded in doing so to help Donald Trump. They say this, Joe, and then they literally say, but where's the crime? Is that a crime? Where's the crime? Can you answer that? Because honestly, some people are like, well, yeah, it's politics, but it's not a crime. That's criminal behavior, isn't it?
It's theoretically it's politics, but it's also a crime. If, in fact, you organize yourselves, combine, and agree together to carry out official acts of the United States government to harm an individual, and in this case, to damage a presidential candidate, to damage a president-elect, and to damage a president who is now in office. Those acts against that individual are to deny him his civil rights, to conspire to interfere in an election, and a number of other crimes involving conspiracy. This isn't a simple crime. It started in 2016, and it goes on until today. It is a 9-year conspiracy, which has never ended. It is complex. It's going to be very difficult for people to understand. This is not guy shoots a gun at somebody on the street, person falls down, murder. This is the destruction of a human being and his family over 9 years for the purpose of obstructing the office of the presidency of the United States. A jury in this country is going to get to decide whether or not what Barack Obama and all those other people did was a conspiracy big enough to be a crime. In my opinion, it's not even a close call. This is the crime of the century.
All right, more with Joe diGenova. Julie has a question about this as well, to follow up what Joe just said. And we've got some other things in the news, including apparently Mark Elias bankrupting Media Matters with legal fees, which is just glorious. We'll get to that in a moment.
WMAL, making sense of the news. Live from the Home Paramount Pest Control Studios. Home Paramount, the leader in pest control since 1939.
All right, Julie Gunlock, get in here. I've been spending way too much time with Joe.
Yeah, just really, last question on this really quickly. You and Larry were talking about how people on the left are trying to make this go away, but we're also seeing it on the right. National Review's op-ed this morning, their editorial rather, it says there's nothing new here, that all of this was known for 8 years and there's nothing new here. What is the explanation for that, Joe? Why are people on the right even people on the right reluctant to recognize this as for what it is, as you say, one of the biggest scandal in our lifetimes.
Well, first of all, this is not your mother's National Review. Let's face it. It has gone downhill over the years. But the issue is this. These folks don't want to deal with this. They want to move on. They want to deal with their issues. They don't care about Donald Trump. Well, you know what? I didn't care about Donald Trump either until I sat up and watched what was being done to him. As a former prosecutor, I looked at the available evidence on the public record in 2016, and it was abundantly clear to me that after Comey gave his famous news conference exonerating Hillary Clinton on July 5th, 2016, that was one of the overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. I said to myself right then, if they don't fire him, this is being done with a purpose. And, of course, they didn't fire him. Loretta Lynch was so compromised because of her relationship with Bill Clinton and her interference in the email server scandal against Hillary Clinton that she couldn't do anything with Comey. This is, the National Review and those people, history simply has to ignore the idiots.
All right. That's a fair enough assessment. All right, a couple of other things. You heard me mention that there was a profile in the New York Times that Media Matters for America that was set up by John Podesta with George Soros money is now facing bankruptcy, and it's because of Mark Elias's firm. This is Elon Musk suing. Trump is also suing Media Matters they've been misrepresenting conservative voices for decades now, and now they're facing bankruptcy. What do you make of how this plays out?
Well, I'm delighted. That couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of people. They've written some awful things about me and my wife. But here's the thing about Mark Elias. There's a man who needs to lawyer up. One of the fascinating things about his campaign against the conservative press through Media Matters and his defense of them is that when you go back and look at the history of all the actions undertaken by various people, Mark Elias and Norm Eisen's name pop up in every one of those. Every one of their actions is going to be scrutinized, I assume, by the upcoming federal grand jury. Just because you're a lawyer, as Donald Trump found out in the investigation of him by Jack Smith, he lost all of his lawyers. He lost the attorney-client privilege. The same thing is going to happen to Mark Elias and Eisen and all of these folks. They are going to be viewed by people who watch this as part of this process. And it's going to be very interesting to see. They're very creative lawyers. They have great resources at their disposal. I'm sure they will defend themselves vigorously, but I can't imagine that this case isn't going to touch on all these lawyers who did various things. For example, how did the E. Jean Carroll case get to be brought? What was the genesis of how that got to be brought? Who funded that litigation? Why was it brought? Who helped get the statute of limitations extended in New York so that case could specifically be brought? Remember, that statute of limitations in New York for rape victims and sexual assault victims was enacted out of the blue. And why did it happen?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like George Conway might want to lawyer up, too. That's very fascinating, Joe. Joe, we also had on Friday, we talked about it, an executive order that President Trump has now put forth that is attempting to compel states to clean up the streets with regard to criminal vagrancy. And so, they call it the homeless crisis. But a huge percentage of those people living on the streets are either addicts or they're suffering from mental illness. And because of the laws with regard to forced hospitalization for people suffering from mental illness, this crisis has been allowed to fester. And not only does it debilitate Western civilization and make it a dangerous place for us taxpayers trying to walk the streets of our cities, but it's actually, by the way, really damaging to those individuals who need help. So what is the legal aspect here and perspective on forced hospitalization for people suffering from mental illness? What can and can't the state do against someone's wishes?
Back in the 1970s and 80s, there was an organization called the Mental Health Law Project. They were on K Street and Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., and they spent years trying to have the civil commitment laws of the United States declared unconstitutional because of the way they treated people and the measures that were used to commit people involuntarily. They won. They won in the Fifth Circuit. They found some friendly judges who were old Democrats down in the South, and they got these laws overturned. States and cities had to rewrite their civil commitment laws. It made it almost impossible to get people off the streets. Those laws exist today. It's problematical. Civil commitment obviously in a free society should be a difficult task. You shouldn't be able to civilly commit anybody for anything. But you cannot ignore the fact that the homeless and the people out on the streets are definitely people with very serious problems, drug problems, mental health problems, depression problems, suicide problems. They have to be dealt with. The issue of involuntary commitment is something this country refuses to deal with. This is going to continue to be a problem. There's not much you can do about it unless you amend the laws, and they have to be consistent with the judicial rulings about, you have to make it hard to commit somebody involuntarily.
Right.
Now, this involuntary commitment has a checkered history. It's been used brutally against blacks and against other people. Women. So this is going to be a tough road to hoe. But let me just tell you something. Just look at Gavin Newsom. Remember how fast they cleaned up the street when the Chinese were coming for a visit?
Yes.
Guess what? They can do it.
Yeah, they found a way when they're trying to celebrate a commie. All right, Joe, we got to leave it there. Absolute banger of a segment this morning. As always, thanks for joining us. Great conversation.
You bet.